Join us for 3 days in Orlando, Florida in February 2025 for an event designed to equip IT professionals like you with the tools, knowledge, and strategies to navigate the ever-changing cybersecurity landscape. Secure your spot and register to join us for 3 days of immersive learning, collaboration, and skill building with hands-on hacking labs and much more.
It's good to be reminded of all of the threats that we face and the different ways that we're vulnerable.
You're only as strong as your weakest link, right? You can have all the tools that you want in place, but if you're not taking care of the end user, I think that's the weakest link there.
Network with peers from around the globe, share experiences, and learn from real-world case studies, all aimed at enhancing your capabilities as an IT professional. Register now for Zero Trust World 2025 and take the first step towards a more secure tomorrow.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Rob. Good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where you're connecting from, I guess.
Good morning, Danny. That man, by the way, in the ad there was very clever. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link.
What man in the ad?
The person in the ad. Chain is only as strong as its weakest link, which leads nicely onto our conversation today. An excellent segue.
Yeah. So you know what? So if you didn't catch that coupon code, Spencer's going to put it in the chat there for us. So there is a discount on Zero Trust World. We are coming up on, I think we're about 60% of the tickets sold, maybe more. I'm not sure so far. I think it's beginning of February or the middle of February, February 19th, I guess. Go to ztw.com and you can register, and Spencer's going to put a coupon code. It is a 3-day event. It is really cool. And the main important thing about it is we're really teaching you how to harden your environment. Yes, we've got hacking labs. We teach you how to use rubber duckies. We teach you how to program pineapples, how to use Metasploits, hands-on labs with laptops. We're also going to have hands-on laptops. So follow us on how to configure your Office 365 account and harden it. Follow us on how to harden Windows servers and things like that. But we want to talk about IoT devices.
And by the way, can I just say your microphone looks very standy-uppy there. You should sort of flatten it down a little bit. This is, by the way, you're missing a trick with yours not having a fluffy piece on it. The fluffiness is awesome with this microphone. It's like my emotional support mic.
Okay, that's good to know, Rob. But the
count as an IoT device. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it counts as an IoT device. But who knows? Everything's got an internet connection now. I was setting up my Wi-Fi. So I recently moved house and I have a smart house. So I set up the Wi-Fi and I was like, you know what? I want to keep everything separate. So I want to make sure that people can't see each other on the Wi-Fi. The IoT devices can't see each other. All the light switches can't see each other. So I was like, you know, there's a button in my Ubiquiti switch is this wonderful button that says isolate items on the network so they can't see each other. And then I got downstairs and I wanted to show something on the TV through AirPlay and it didn't work. so very quickly my house became from extremely isolated to not so isolated because it was a lot harder than I thought to isolate everything so it couldn't see each other on the network. And this is part of the challenge we've got with IoT devices. I think Microsoft released a stat. Now, I know these stats don't mean that much, but 90% of attacks involved an unprotected device on the network. 90% of ransomware attacks recently. And that's somewhat terrifying. And not all of those were IoT devices. We see a lot of laptops, home laptops, people bringing their own devices in. But IoT devices is a huge part of that.
Absolutely, it is. I mean, my favorite IoT hack of all time was the smart heater in a fish tank story. Somebody told me that, and I actually thought they were making it up, but apparently it was true. A smart heater in a fish tank was used to exfiltrate data from a network. So, as you said, it is slightly terrifying. People don't think about all those things that are on the network.
Which network was that?
It was a casino.
Oh, casino.
Casino.
You know what terrifies me?
Tell me.
We have a tank in the office.
Do we have a smart heater in it, though? That's the question.
I don't know if it's smart. It's a heater. So
we should probably check that out.
Yeah, hopefully we don't have a backdoor onto our network through our fish tank.
Follow-up items, yes.
So
But it's just a really good example. There's so many of these things on people's network these days, and they don't even think about them. I mean, the amount of CCTV systems. I mean, as you said, home networks are especially terrifying. I used to make a joke once upon a time about the fact that my network at home, I did a scan of it and I could see 40, 50, 60 devices on it, of which one was my oven. And the joke I used to make was, well, I can tell you one thing with absolute certainty, which is I've never patched my oven, but it's sitting on my network the same as my work computer.
and how many of those were Apple devices, Rob?
Um, a
48.
depressingly large number, a depressingly large number. But
Yes.
yeah, that was back home in Ireland. My problem here is much bigger because it's not only my oven, it's my fridge, it's my microwave. I mean, all of those different things that are on our network. I mean, I had to before I could use my fridge, I had to update it. So I can now say I have updated a fridge.
Yes, and I think that's the challenge we have. Of course, at home we've got fridges and pool heaters and light switches and other things like that. But in the office, we also have lots of smart devices, microwaves, ovens, CCTV cameras, and lots of devices that aren't patched, and printers. And
Yeah, I was going to say sometimes not so smart devices. I mean, printers are a huge thing. I had the privilege of speaking to a couple of pen testers at Zero Trust World last year, and they said to me their favorite thing to see on a network is a printer because they're always on sensitive parts of networks because they need to be close to people's computer or accessible on people's computers. Never patched, never updated. Very often, 5, 6, 7, 10 years old sometimes. I mean, again, IT guy background here, but I don't think I've ever seen a printer or multifunction device that doesn't use the default username and password. You want to know what the password is for a particular MFP device? Just Google it. It's
I think we should take a vote and ban printers from all networks. I think most IT would agree with that.
already basically done that, haven't we?
I don't know if that's true though. Okay.
Daniel has actually asked a question, just back to the Zero Trust World for a second. He said, are those hacking labs and classes you mentioned available online or on demand?
No, they're only. Well, let me rephrase that. Anything on main stage is online, but the ones, all the breakout sessions are not online. So we only have one session that's online. The rest are in breakout sessions. They may be recorded. We do webinars as well. We will be doing webinars again soon. I'm sure we've got our regular Pineapple webinar coming up before Zero Trust World, where Rob.
No more pineapple. And by the way, I still notice in that ad there's my wearing the Chief Pineapple Officer joke T-shirt.
So it's we'll have our Pineapple webinar coming up, but Rob says I'm not allowed to use a drone. So
no. Sorry, and just another thing, Danny. So anonymous attendee has asked, can you share the link to the Microsoft report where 90% of ransomware is attributable to unmanaged devices? It's called the Microsoft Digital Defense Report 2024.
Yeah. Let's just copy this here.
Yeah, it's in the ransomware section of that Digital Defense Report 2024.
Okay.
Excellent.
And Microsoft said it, so it must be right.
Definitely.
Okay, so what do we want to do here? We want to talk about some of the popular ransomware attacks, but we also want to think about what can we do and how can we harden our environment to stop attacks from IoT devices and to IoT devices. Here's the biggest challenge, the reality of it. I remember working with a hospital here in Orlando, and they have an integration system that operates the OR. So all the lights, everything in the operating room is completely controlled. And the integration system, nothing bad happened, nobody died, so it wasn't. But one day it started DDoSing Amazon servers from the computer that controls the lights and all of the tools that the surgeon's using. And there was a report from the firewall that it was sending millions and millions of attacks on Amazon servers. And somehow the device had been infected with malware. Now, there was no web browser on the device, or if there was, nobody had connected to the web browser on the device. It was a Windows machine. But it was, I'll use the word locked down. It wasn't locked down, but it wasn't a usable device for a user. You could connect to it through a web portal, and you could upload and get videos from the operating room, and you could make configuration changes, and it had some smart switches and things like that. But it didn't have an interface where a user could download malware. And the assumption was that the way the device got malware was not actually from the device itself, but from another device on the network that had been infected with malware that then spread to that device through a vulnerability. Because also IoT devices tend not to get patched very often, so found some kind of an exploit on an RPC vulnerability. Now, the challenge we have with IoT devices is some of them we can protect. Some of them you can put an agent on, you can harden, you can configure, you can do things. And we do a lot of that. We do airports and hospitals and a lot of devices. You can do that. You can literally go and put ThreatLocker on there and say, I'm going to close all inbound ports except X. I'm going to block all programs except Y. I'm going to make this device hard. But so many of them you can't protect, either for physical reasons because they're running some kind of garbage operating system that no one supports, or because the vendor will void your warranty. So if you go and buy a $10 million MRI machine and you try and put a security tool on it, the vendor now says your warranty is void on this device and we don't support it. And if it's not supported, there's various regulations, especially in healthcare, that make it very difficult. So we've got to do two things. One is we've got to figure out how can we protect devices that we can protect, which is pretty easy. I mean, install your agent, lock things down, use whitelisting, use ring fencing, control only the applications. And they're really easy devices to do that with. Unfortunately, that's not the biggest bucket. The second thing is how do we protect the devices we can't protect? And there's really two things you need to focus on here. You can't fully protect them. Some devices can be air-gapped. So if you can put a small firewall in front of your device that says nothing can connect to it and it can only go out to the internet on export, you're going to do a really good job at hardening it. Put it on a VLAN, put some kind of routing. I mean, it doesn't have to be a physical firewall. It can be virtual firewall, so it's on its own private network. If you can have your IoT devices, if your IoT devices only need to go out to the internet, and you can have it so they can't see your network, but they can only go out to the internet, it's a relatively easy thing to do. And I reckon that 60 or 70% of the remaining devices probably fall into that category where they need very limited access to your network and you need very limited access to them because they're just sitting there by themselves. And a good example of that is my pool heater, not heater, my pool management system, Pentair system. It goes out and
management system.
Yeah, we're in Florida. Everyone has a pool.
The first of first world problems.
Yeah, it goes out to the internet. So I was able to isolate that from my network. So it still goes out to the internet. Do I trust it won't be hacked and one day I'll get into my pool and it'll be heated to 100 degrees? No, but it can't see the rest of my house. So you can do that with a lot of devices in the office too. If you've got a smart, I remember there was a school here in Florida that got hacked and they had a device. Now the IT department didn't know it existed. They had a device plugged into the network. It had TeamViewer on it, and it was a device to check in kids into preschool. And the device wasn't managed by IT. They had no control over it, but it needed an internet connection. So it plugged into the Ethernet, and it got access to the internet, and then someone connected to it, and they ransomwared and cryptoed the server remotely. If that device had been on an isolated network so it could only go out to the internet, it would have continued to perform its job correctly. However, it wasn't. So there's a lot to be said about that. Looking at what you can take air gap so it doesn't need to see the internet, or what you can let see the internet but nothing see it, put it behind some kind of firewall. The third type of device is the one I really want to focus on because that's the hardest one. The ones that you need on your network, printers, Wi-Fi routers, things like that. And there is a relatively basic checklist here. First of all, patch them, like update them and put them in your inventory. Whatever software you use to manage your IT inventory, make sure they're listed in there and have a scheduled task to check for updates on the device. There are so many vulnerabilities on these devices. It doesn't cost anything. A few hours of your time every month, you put aside, you go through all those IoT devices that you've inventoried, and you say, I'm going to patch these devices. Change the default password, and don't make them all the same. Even if you've updated the devices, half of those devices have 50 vulnerabilities. People who write printers aren't security people. They're not thinking about how could someone break into my printer. So make sure you have a different password for every single IoT device. So that makes it a lot harder for an attacker to get in your network. The third thing you want to do is figure out, well, how does an attacker get on this device anyway? And this is quite often when we see the attack sequence. I don't know if you've got examples here, Rob, on this. An attacker will come in on an endpoint. So somebody will download a piece of software. They'll put a reverse shell on your endpoint, and they'll gain access to the endpoint. Now, they don't want to hang out on the endpoint because the endpoint might go offline. They want to hang out on something else. So this is where they'll actually look for the printers and the other devices because they can then go and put malware or something, a foothold on that printer. In order for someone to get on the printer in the first place, they had to come in an endpoint because there's no interface for the printer onto the internet. There's no user going in and browsing the web and downloading free software that they can get on. So thinking about your network security posture generally and saying, hey, I want to look at all my endpoints and say, I want to make sure my endpoints can't run untrusted software. My endpoints are patched. My endpoints don't have remote access tools that don't have dual factor authentication put on there. That stops the initial foothold coming into your business to begin with. But then also from the other side, protecting the endpoints from the device, because we have to assume that one of these devices is going to get compromised. And quite often they'll have a wireless antenna and a wired, or they'll be wireless and someone will break into the Wi-Fi and then they're on your network without an endpoint. I'm going to pause for a second because I know you've got a few stories you want to tell here, Rob.
No, it's a great example, or it's a great way if you are an attacker of avoiding or evading defenses. Because I mean, most organizations have EDRs and MDRs and antiviruses and all those sort of things in play, but they're running, generally speaking, on the endpoints. So if I can somehow get onto an endpoint and move laterally onto something else on the network that I know isn't running an EDR or isn't running, security software that isn't going to trigger alerts, then it's basically game on from that point onwards. So yeah, that's why these devices are so dangerous and something that everybody needs to consider. Just back for 1 second. So David Barnes asked the question, which is, what do you recommend for mitigating risk for printers on corporate networks?
So this is where the harder part comes in, because printers need to be on the network and because you need to see them. And on the other side, they're vulnerable. So I think step one, the first two things: change the passwords, make sure they're locked down. The next thing you want to deal with is, we've already talked about, look, make sure your endpoints are secure because you do not want someone moving to your printer. But you also have to assume that someone did move to your printer, and you want to figure out how you can mitigate this. If your printer has a static IP address, which it probably does or should, block its internet access on the firewall. It makes, and by the way, that not just printers, servers. You know how many SolarWinds Orion, Exchange, Eternal Blue, all of these quite often needed internet connection to get their malicious payload. If it doesn't need to browse the internet, take its internet access away. So go onto your firewall and say 192.168.50.4 is a printer. It cannot access the internet. And someone's going to get really mad one day because they're trying to figure out something and it's that IP address is not allowed to access the internet. But hey, make sure it's in your documentation. Take its internet access away if it doesn't need internet access. And most printers don't need internet access on your network. And some of them do. Some of them are, you can do email prints and things like this. But that's one of the options. The other thing is, you have to figure out that every device on your network can also see your computers. And the reason someone hangs out on a printer is one or two reasons. One is to steal data being printed on the printer, which isn't that exciting, by the way. You don't make much money on, hey, I managed to print out stuff. But they do, I mean, it is a thing. If you're in a healthcare industry and you're printing very confidential documents, then they want to steal the data. Now, in order for them to steal the data from the printer, they need to be able to get that data off the printer. That comes down to make sure it can't access the internet. The second thing they need to do is figure out how to attack the rest of your network. And while the printer has to be on the same network as your PCs and your servers, it doesn't necessarily need to be able to see your PCs and servers from an inbound port point of view. So they need to be able to see it, but it doesn't need to see them. The same as your PCs need to be able to see your server, but your server doesn't need to connect to your PCs. So focus on device-based firewalls, because we want to protect the printer, but we also want to protect the devices from the printer. So put a firewall on all of your endpoints. First of all, in 2002, Microsoft added the firewall into Windows XP to block all inbound traffic. In most cases, that's a perfectly acceptable environment where you block all inbound traffic. Even if you're trusted in your LAN, there's no such thing as a trusted network anymore. Make sure all inbound devices ports are blocked. Now, I know what you're going to say. You can't do that on servers because the servers need to respond to the clients. So if I've got a UNC, and I think number one ransomware cases we've seen in the last 3 months, Rob, is remote encryption.
Yeah, back to that Microsoft report. Another interesting snippet from it was we observed remote encryption in 70% of successful attacks. So 70% of successful ransomware attacks involved remote encryption. So something not managed, basically, or something not, it's not ransomware running on a server for the most part. It's ransomware on another device on the network encrypting data on a server.
So that comes back down to, well, how do we protect our device from remote encryption? Because it's not running on the server and the files are shared to the users. So we don't want the user to be able to change the device. And I'm going to pose 2 suggestions, and maybe we could share a screen here and actually show people how to do this if you're a ThreatLocker customer. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is think about storage. So there's a few things you can do with storage. First of all, when you've got files on your server, so let's just go into my servers group here, and I can pick an individual server. I can set up policies to monitor and to protect my files. So I can go in here. I want to all my important files. I just create a policy, and I'm just going to permit, but I'm only going to allow. I'm just going to permit everything access. And what this will do, at very least, it will monitor the file. So I'm going to say on my server. So if you're using ThreatLocker and you've got a server, go and put this in your group. I've got a shared folder here. So this is an important file because this will cause them to be monitored immediately by ThreatLocker. And I'm going to set up my payroll folder. We can use multiple hard drives as well. I'm going to set up my, what else would a company have? Databases.
Share.
Sorry?
Yeah, I was going to say shares.
Yeah, so I did shared folder, and then we'll say user shares. User share, shares. Whatever, it doesn't really matter. You just go in here, you put these in here. Now I've created this, and this causes ThreatLocker to monitor them. So this is really cool because if someone changes a file, like if I don't have a share on here, but I'm going to do it in my documents folder. But if someone went in and say change this file here, should we just create a new one? Because I'm not going to remember. I cannot create a new file. Okay, I'll just change this one. Save. All of this is going to get logged. So within a couple of minutes, I'll be able to see. I've got hello 123 here. Let me save that as well. That's an easier one to remember. Documents. So if I change this file, if I delete it, everything here is getting monitored, which by itself is really, really useful because I can see, if I just type here, I'll give it a few minutes and that'll come up and show you that. Now, we can also do things around that where we can protect it. So if you're using ThreatLocker Detect, for example, you could come in here and say, hey, I want to set a limit on reads and writes. And we can do this from the user side as well. So you could say if more than, I'm going to monitor this thing, I'm going to say, and I can even pick a policy here. So I can say limit the number of writes on, what's the name of that folder? Important files. And I can go in here. And by the way, we've got some community policies on this, but I'm going to say action type is write, matches write. And we can do this straight from the endpoint as well. And this we could put a lower number. And then we could say if the policy, sorry. I can remember, I'm pretty sure I call it important files. I don't know. Or maybe it's free text. And the policy name is important. I think if I actually pick policy here, it'll actually pick it for me. Yeah, important files. That's even better. So if basically I say if the action type is right and the policy matches my important files, if any of this happens, and I just want to put a limit on this because if someone tries to access too many of them, I'm going to say, and the occurrence is greater than, I'm going to say 200 in 60 minutes. Then what I want to do is I want to create an alert. I'm going to say something suspicious. I can put a bunch of details in here. It's not really viable. If you're using ThreatLocker MDR, you can actually request that we monitor these alerts as well for you 24 hours a day by the request section here. And then I'm also going to create, but I want to do something else because alerts are kind of useless unless you respond really quick. So if somebody starts encrypting all those files from a remote device, you don't want to have to wait for someone to respond. Even if you use ThreatLocker MDR, where it's minutes, the response, you could be 500, 600, 1,000 files encrypted in, or even 2,000 files within minutes. So we want to do more than that. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to enable a storage policy at the same time. And I'm going to enable block all writes. And I can create that storage policy. So what this basically does is it says, if somebody writes more than 200 important files within 60 minutes, I'm just going to turn off writes until we've managed to review the alert and check it wasn't suspicious. So this is a way of saying, well, I'm not necessarily going to protect everything, but I'm going to limit. Now there's a better solution. So this is the oops, we made a mistake. So whenever we're thinking about security, we're thinking about two parts. If we do everything right, then we should never get to a situation where someone's encrypting our files from our printer or from our network at all. Because if you think about it, just take a normal network without a printer for a minute. If you've got no untrusted software running and you haven't allowed RDP open onto your network and you're ring fencing programs like PowerShell, how could somebody get onto your machine to encrypt files to your server in the first place? There's not really a viable path. And it's not impossible. Nothing's impossible, but it's very, very difficult. But the reason we have detection as a technology is for when the IT guy left RDP open. It was temporarily open to fix something, or somebody allowed TeamViewer to run because someone needed remote support from QuickBooks or some kind of company, and it wasn't removed from the environment. So, and then somebody got onto there and they accessed the printer and they put something on there. So this is always the ups reason. So when we create this detect policy, this is saying, hey, this should never happen, but if it does, I want you to take another action to stop it happening. The other thing we can do, and this is probably the most important thing you can do, you can go into ThreatLocker here and you can say, I want to allow access. So this is a firewall. So network controller is a firewall. I want to permit access to AD ports. You have a policy in community which you can add for AD ports, and you can do file shares and other things. And I want to permit it for my entire organization. So we use these things called objects. And what an object is it basically tracks all of your managed devices in ThreatLocker. And as their IP addresses change, it automatically updates their IP address. And when you come into your network and someone uses DHCP and they get your IP address, if they're on their home laptop, they're not going to be inside this object. And you can pick an individual computer. So you could say, for example, I want the IT computers, so I don't have IT computers in here, or developers to access RDP, but I don't want any of my normal users to. And it'll track the developer's laptop and it will close the port or open it. But in this case, we basically said, I want to allow anyone in my organization to access my Active Directory server, and it will just track their IP addresses in real time. So I want to permit that. And then I've got another one here. So I guess actually this is probably the community one that was pre-set up for me. And here I can see that here's my Active Directory ports, and I've done the same thing. So all objects are allowed to access Active Directory. But then what I've done is I've denied all ports. And the reason this is important is while your printer needs to be accessible from your Active Directory server, your Active Directory server doesn't need to be accessible from your printer. It might be from your users. So what we've done here is we've basically created a deny all inbound traffic policy. If someone comes onto your network from an untrusted device and they scan your network, they will not be able to see your Active Directory server. But if you come in from a ThreatLocker protected device, what will happen is when you try and connect to the Active Directory server, it's going to connect back to that device. It's going to authenticate it through a challenge. And then it's going to say, yeah, my ports are open. This is probably the most important thing you can do if you want to stop attacks from untrusted devices on your network, or even unmanaged devices, IoT devices, unknown devices, because you can go in, you allow the ports you need, and you close everything else. If your server currently allows all open ports and you've got no firewall on your server, you could literally just say, hey, for now, I'm just going to open all ports. I'll change this to all ports. So I'm going to deny, and then I'll just say deny for everything else. And then I'll figure out which ports I'm using and limit it even further. It's better to limit it out the box, but you can start off with that because it's better than what you have now. Like I said, Microsoft said 70%. I'd say that's about right. 7 out of 10 ransomware attacks we've seen are remote encryption.
Comfortably. Victor, and this is relevant to what you just spoke about, Victor said printers need to scan to email. So then open port 25 or whatever port it's going to use to that device and that device only. So
yeah, and if that's a perfect example. So if I say allow, I think we're mostly using 587 now, but maybe 25.
Sorry, I'm showing my age there, Danny.
Yeah. So but we could say 25 and 5. We could say SMTP on here. And look, when I even did that and I say SMTP again, it even gave me 587 for secure. Wasn't that kind of it? So I can add have to click
supports.
SMTP, click add. It's added those in for me, and then I could say permit, and I could say my source is my printer's IP address. And you can go and type the IP address in here. So you can say 192.168.50.1 or 6 or whatever. You can also create what's quite cool is in network control here. We're going to do a full webinar on network control. You can create these tags. So you could say email printers. And you could say list all your IP addresses in here. I could type. You could add them all in here. And then rather than updating every single policy that has an email printer, you can go into network control and you can just use the tag in there, which is quite cool when you're selecting your source. Oh, I'm entire wrong server. Okay, what else have we got? I knew you had an interesting infographic on top IoT. Do you want to go through them?
We've got a few of them. I mean, first of all, there are some really good comments. So, by the way, when I mentioned speaking to pen testers, Zero Trust World, one of them is actually on the call here, which is Steve. Hi, Steve. He made a couple of really good points. So he said, I run an IoT VLAN at home. Scary to think how many companies aren't isolating these devices and only permitting ports that need to be used for it to work, which is basically what you've been talking about. He also mentioned, and he said 100% with Danny on this one, stop letting network traffic move around the network in directions it doesn't need to go. Like how many client devices can go out to the internet for DNS when you have a domain controller sat in the LAN doing that DNS for them? A lot of bad actors are using traditionally unrestricted outbound ports, as Danny says, for payload retrieval, etc. So basically, Steve is very much agreeing with you. Anonymous attendee said, "You guys rock." Thank you, anonymous attendee. Avi made a suggestion. You guys making a hardened Linux micro firewall with ThreatLocker on it, so I can firewall my devices behind a ThreatLocker firewall. Maybe call it Threat Wall.
We just renamed Third Wall.
Yeah. David's got some questions about Linux, which is fine.
But we have NAT coming onto Linux very soon. It's on beta, so anyone who's brave enough to try a beta version on their server, please do.
Coming as a question. So Henry Steele has asked, when is network control coming for Linux devices? Would love to see ThreatLocker leverage IP tables and NetFilter with something like this, or just like SE Linux is used for application control. So yes, that's coming. Is the network control module a replacement for local software-based firewalls on desktops?
Yes. And what's nice about it is when you deploy ThreatLocker, it will actually let you monitor all of the network traffic. So if you don't have any policy in place, it will come in and do like a green deny. So if you're used to ThreatLocker, you could use to seeing the green deny. So you can come in here and you can actually say, hey, I want to look at simulate denies, and it will show you all network traffic that would have been denied if you had been if you'd had a deny policy in place. And you don't have to be in monitor only. It's going to show you that if you have no deny policy. So then you can go and look at that, see if you want it, add an allow rule, and then create a deny rule when you're done. And you don't have to turn off the Windows firewall. We'll automatically override the rules. If you have a deny, so example, if you came in here today, and some people are just doing this as a really quick thing, and I love really quick fixes where you can get an instant win, but that doesn't mean don't do the proper job and do it properly. But one of the things we're saying to people right now is, hey, just go in here and put a deny on RDP except from your trusted devices. And even if you're not looking at the other ports, it'll be a big win if you've got servers that you forgot about. If you've got multiple sub-organizations, you can go in a global policy and say, hey, I want to automatically deny RDP unless it's from one of these trusted devices. And it's an instant win. And it's not perfect, but it's ultimately you want to have a denial policy.
You have no idea how many ransomware attacks that would stop. Even aside from the remote encryption, I mean, obviously 70% is probably a good estimate of that, but a lot of them will actually use RDP at some stage in their execution too. So blocking, you're just stopping lateral movement. As you said, and I think you said this before, Danny, I mean, generally speaking, there's no reasons for workstations to be able to talk to each other. What was the statistic that the guy you spoke after mentioned? He said, is it an average of 62 minutes?
Yes, our friend over at CrowdStrike, George. So George, we're at an event last week. George was speaking just before me, and he said the average time to move from one device to another device on the network is 62 minutes, and the average time can be as little as 2 minutes. So I don't want to put that into perspective because this is obviously one of our competitors who speaks very highly about detection and response being important, and don't disagree with detection and response being important. But when you think about 62 minutes to make a decision if someone hacking your system at average and as low as 2 minutes, it's too scary. You can't detect and respond quick enough to too many attacks. So if you were to think about configuring hardening, so at very least you're slowing people down. So if someone tries to run an IP scanner and it's getting blocked, well, you've just slowed them down. If someone tries to move to another device and it gets blocked, at very least you're slowing them down so your detection and response teams can respond quicker. Because if they're already on your network, it's a problem. Even if you don't want to go block all ports and you're worried about other ports, blocking SMB ports is not a bad idea too. 445, if you just go and create a policy to block 445, 139, unless it's from a trusted device, that's going to immediately block SMB from anything that's not trusted on your network, on your servers. And it makes it much harder for these IoT devices to eat your lunch. And I can't plead enough for customers, because nearly every ransomware attack we see, like I said, is a remote device that isn't protected. Please put these network policies in place. If you don't know how, just schedule a call with your engineer and they will help you. It takes a few minutes. And if you're not sure, put the policy in place. We'll come back a week later and see what would have hit it, and then we'll modify it as need be.
Relevant to that, David Barnes, again, I'm tired of all these people agreeing with you, Danny, but he said 100% on the network control monitoring. Within an hour of switching it on, we found an Azure server with RDP exposed to the internet.
So I have a more terrifying, I don't know if anyone on the call is an MSP or uses an MSP. There's probably both. We had a rather terrifying experience where we had a really, really big MSP, about 30,000 endpoints on trial. And they came into our support desk and they said that their EDR had detected an alert, an attack, a rootkit to a Russian IP address. So they were using our allow listing, they weren't using our network control. And we went onto their machine and we said, why do you think we see no rootkit on this machine? We're looking at every execution. There's no rootkit running on this machine. And support told them there wasn't a rootkit. They weren't happy. So I jumped on a call to say, let's have a look. Why do you think there's a rootkit? And he showed me the error. And it was a very ambiguous error, which wasn't very useful. But I said, can you do me a favor? Can you open up the Windows event log on the machine? So I opened up the Windows event log, and there's about 10,000 invalid logins from a Russian IP address, not a rootkit. RDP was open on the machine. I said, that's not a rootkit. That's saying RDP invalid login. And they weren't using ThreatLocker Detect. They weren't using ThreatLocker Network Control. They were just using our allow listing. I said, can you turn on network control for me? And he said, no, they're not using... RDP is not open. I said, RDP is open. I can see the connections like here. And in the end, I said, well, here, let me share my screen. I shared my screen. I opened up RDP. I typed in his IP address from the computer check-in, and I immediately got a login prompt onto his computer. And he's like, why is RDP open? This was a level 3 tech that had taken their laptop home, and apparently working from home wasn't convenient enough for them, so they wanted to work from their friend's house. So they'd opened up RDP on their home firewall to their work laptop, which had software deployment tools and everything on it, so they could push out whatever they want. And they were one password away from someone getting onto that machine and being able to access it. So having that policy in place, you can just deny everything remotely, and it doesn't matter if someone's opened RDP on the home firewall, it cannot get into that machine. And if you want to set your IT computer as an exception, it's very easy. You just go in and say, I'm going to allow RDP as long as it's from my device, and it will track your IP address wherever you are in the world, and it will open the port automatically within a few seconds of you connecting.
Rex Knight has asked, are attacks from bad actors such as Iran, North Korea, Russia, etc., of the same level as from smaller group attacks?
So I think
I actually just mentioned something on this subject. So very often ransomware gangs in general are not after you specifically. I'm not going to say that, well, I am going to say, I mean, they're fundamentally lazy. They're looking for low-hanging fruit historically. If there is a state sponsored or state actor, or the other one that would be after you specifically is hacktivists. So hacktivists and state sponsored are typically after you, and they will keep going after you until they get in.
Well, it depends if you've got something hacktivists don't like.
Well, that's true. That's true. But generally speaking, ransomware groups are not like that. They're not after you specifically. But one thing that we have seen somewhat more recently is that some of these groups are becoming more and more persistent. So once upon a time, if you did all the right things and make your environment really unfriendly and, you know, just basically make their lives difficult, they would typically pivot and move on to some other target. Not so much anymore. What we're seeing is a tendency for them to keep at it until they find a way around your defenses. And to the point of the webinar, very often that is unmanaged or IoT devices on the network. So they are becoming more persistent of late in a similar-ish way to some of those state-sponsored groups.
Now, also on the point of countries, so there's a difference between state-sponsored and state-ignored. Most of the ransomware attacks Russia being the single biggest point where we see the attack delivered. But it's worth noting that the attack's delivered in Russia, but quite often initiated elsewhere. So the way that this works is, say you leave RDP open or on the internet, or you open an attachment, a reverse shell, and somebody gains access to your machine. That could be some guy sitting in Connecticut sending out emails saying, hey, open this. And then he might get access to your computer, and he might get access to 500 computers. Now, the guy in Connecticut is not likely to launch an attack on your machine, because when you're in Connecticut, the feds are going to kick down your door and send you to prison for a very long time. But what he might do is go online on the dark web and sell all of that access at $500 a pop. And you'll see it traded on the dark web. If you go on the dark web, you can see people trading RDP access and things like this. So they'll say, hey, do you want to buy our RDP access for $500? Or this access to this machine? And then someone in Russia, and it might trade 2 or 3 times, they might then build more backdoors, collect information, get insurance policies. So you'll literally see, hey, RDP access, this is how much their cyber insurance is, this is how much they're in the bank account. We've already done all the research, but we're not willing to encrypt their files because we'll go to prison for it. So they'll go and sell it at a more expensive price in that case. Quite often it's Russian organizations or Russian, and they're organizations, they're not individual people, that will launch the attack, because Russia's unlikely to prosecute. And now I say that knowing that the attack in 2021, where there was people that were responsible for the KSA attack, some of them were sentenced to prison in Russia last week. But I think, first of all, the sentence was pathetic, and secondly, do I actually trust they're going to prison? So the US put extreme pressure in that case, because it was a very, very big attack. But I think that's why we see Russia. The attacks don't necessarily start in Russia. They start all over the world. They finish in Russia because it's harder to convict those people, and they're more likely willing to extort you for your data back.
Just on that subject, I for some reason I just love this sentence. But anonymous attendee said, FYI have been seeing large, slow-moving Russian brute force attacks originating for Ashburn, Virginia, geolocated IP address subnets. Large, slow-moving Russian brute force attacks.
Blame everything on DC. That's the strategy. so everything's from and look, they obviously use servers in DC as well. The old days of using Russian IP addresses is changed dramatically, but you can get virtual servers. Also, quite often they'll use PCs, so they'll spread malware to lots of PCs, and they'll use brute force attacks from lots of PCs, and then they'll ship those credentials back, because there's no point in them ransomwaring some home user. Give me your pictures back.
Henry has asked a question relevant to ThreatLocker network control. He said, I feel like auth hosts aren't covered enough. While we're in the weeds talking about network control in depth and discussing NATed devices, it would be good to touch on it for those who don't know about this feature of network control.
Okay, so an auth host is essentially the same thing. So what we want to do is we want to validate the source of the account. So if you've got a user connecting to a server, we want to make sure the user has permission to connect to that server before they connect. And the way we normally do that is 3 different ways. The first way is when you try and connect to the server, and this is normally on the LAN, the server will actually connect back to you. It will send you a random string as a challenge, and you send a shard value back. And if the values match what we expect, we say this is who it says it is. We know the object of this user now. The nice thing about that is it doesn't require any communication with the internet. It's very, very quick. It's very, very efficient and very effective on LANs. So when you're talking about IoT devices on your network, not being able to see your server, that's important. The second way we can do it is we can actually go to ThreatLocker and we can say, hey, either a public or a private IP address is trying to connect to me. So the agent on the server says, hey, someone's just tried to connect to me on port 3389 from 192.168.60.5 or 50.5.3.1 public IP address. And then the server, ThreatLocker's data center, will say, yes, I know what that IP address is. It belongs to Bob. And this is Bob's object ID. So if you have a policy to let Bob on, it is Bob. I've checked that and we've validated it. And you'll often see that if you're using the new beta version of ThreatLocker, you can actually see the IP address. I think, so if I went into, so if I clicked on this, obviously this doesn't belong to anyone. So when I click on this, it's going to say this doesn't belong to any known devices. And this is a new feature in the, I don't know if it's on the live portal yet, is it?
No, I think it's beta only.
But if it was a valid object, it'll tell you who it is. So they'll go to ThreatLocker and check the IP address. And that's nice and easy, because the way you configure that is you go into modules, you go to network control, and you literally just say, I want to add the object. And there's some ways you can choose which ways it will authenticate as the options. And I don't want to spend too much time on that because we've got a whole webinar on NAC. But you go into here and you say, my source has to be one of these objects. So, and you can use a group, you can use a computer, you can use anything you want. And it will track the IP address and validate if the source is that. The other way we can do is this thing called a keyword. And that's where auth hosts come in. This is useful in one area. And that is where you are connecting to a server, but for some reason, your IP address isn't going to match if what you check in with ThreatLocker. So if you use a VPN, for example, like ExpressVPN, if you go to whatsmyip.com and whatsmyipaddress.com, it will show you two different IP addresses. So if you're connected to ExpressVPN, the same principle is going to apply. You go to api.threatlocker.com or you go to another ThreatLocker and you go to whatsmyip.com, you'll get two IP addresses. Or you connect to your server, you get a different IP address. So when you check into ThreatLocker and it says, hey, what IP address is 50.4.3.1, it's going to say, I don't know. It's not on my list, even though it's the same device. So what a keyword does is it allows you to connect to the same device. You open a second port on the same device. So it's kind of like knock on this door, authenticate, and then I'll open up this port for you. So you open up a web server on your second device. You say, I want to create a new auth host. And you tell it all of your clients should go off and connect to, or whatever group of your clients should periodically authenticate themselves with your server. So you could say, my server is RDP server dot, which obviously we're never going to do. And I'm going to have this second port, this 8810, and I'm going to send this randomized string to that every 5 minutes. Every 5 minutes, your PC is going to go and connect to your RDP server and say, hey, this is my IP address. Remember me. And even if you're not connecting to RDP. And then when you go in, and it's going to pass in this string. When you go in, well, it passes in a shard hidden version of the string. You can then say, I want to allow anyone that's authenticated with this string. So when you go into the source, you say my keyword is this, and if anyone's authenticated with that string, I should let them in. So it's useful when you're unable to manage the source IP address from other methods. You just pre-authenticate by directly connecting to that server. So hopefully that answered the question.
Beautifully. Tim Ackerman has asked, we've been told we need to add NDR and integrate it with our CrowdStrike MDR. With everything you all do on the network, are you moving into that space?
Well, we do have networking detection response based on already, and you can integrate it. You can send it to CrowdStrike. You can send it to any kind of SIM if you want, but we already have, and you can send it to syslog servers or REST APIs or anything you want with ThreatLocker Detect. But right now, if you're using ThreatLocker Detect, we will alert of network alert. So if somebody tries to connect to your server, actually, number one call from our MDR team is, hey, we're just letting you know you've got a Russian trying to connect to your RDP server. You probably should close that port. I think that is the number one call from our MDR team. And we will use those network logs for that.
The scary part is, Danny, how many people say it's fine, don't worry about it?
Yeah, look.
It's really
we try really, really hard.
We do.
And yeah, look,
so many people say it's fine, that's open.
I say that if someone calls you from the MDR team and says, hey, you're getting connections from a public IP on your RDP server, please don't ask them to add an exception. Please go in and just create a network rule to allow the exception based on a keyword or a trusted object or something else, because we see it all the time. And the next call we're going to make to you is, hey, someone's trying to run advanced IP scanner on your server on Mimikatz, and it's been blocked because you're using allow listing, but they're on your server as a local admin. So eventually they will get your password.
Speaking of IoT, actually, and I suppose RDP exposed to the internet is a variation of that, but Shodan has a search feature where you can search a particular area for a particular port. So I did a search not too long ago for port 3389 in the Orlando area, and there was over 900 devices with 3389 exposed to the internet, including, screenshots with the username is, whatever the org is, /Bob. I mean, that's 900 orgs that are a guessed or brute force password away from being the next ransomware attack victims. So yeah, if you do get a call from MDR and they're saying you're getting weird connections on an RDP port, please do something about it. Glenn has asked a strange question. You showed storage control. When will ThreatLocker support monitoring drives without drive letters?
We do support monitoring drives up.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's a strange question.
You could literally go in. Are you talking about UNC or any kind of path? You can put any path you want in here, and it will monitor it. So when you go into storage control, you just literally create a policy, and you say monitor X, and you can go in. And now I will say, if you don't know how it's formatted, because sometimes the operating system formats it in a slightly different way to what you see it, but you can go into here. Say you didn't know what the format was, you could put something like, hey, I'm going to just put in star backslash my folder backslash test, and then that will monitor everything that matches that pattern. Don't do this because it will kill your C drive. So I promise you. But if you could put a folder name in or something.
Oh, sorry. Glenn has said no physical disk like Windows Server backup uses. Yeah, Glenn, what Danny's showing here will show you what those devices are, what devices they are called, or how you access them, basically.
Yeah,
I had something similar, Danny. We had a customer who was running, I think they were running VMs on a clustered storage location. And it was, I can't remember, it was like backslash server, backslash cluster 0, backslash whatever. But yeah, if you do what Danny is showing you here, Glenn, you should be able to see those devices pretty clearly.
Yes. And we are actually making a change, because one of the challenges we've had, and my desk is falling apart underneath me. One of the challenges we've had is customers who haven't necessarily monitored certain areas that are protected. So by default, ThreatLocker monitors all UNCs, all USB drives, all and then we have built-in standard policies to monitor your documents and desktop folders. So if it's an external storage, we monitor it, and it's built-in policies. Now, there's two problems it actually causes us. One is when someone has their entire profile folder redirected, it scratches those temporary files, which causes performance issues. So we have to make exclusions then. The other problem it causes, if you haven't monitored it, then it's not going to do anything. So we are making a change in a very soon build, where by default, instead of having those explicit storage, we're actually going to monitor file types as protected file types. So docx, PDF, PowerPoints, Excel, QuickBooks, backup files, files types you'd expect to see that aren't necessarily program files or temp files. And you can go and add into that and change as you please as well. But right now, you can go in and you can change, and you can technically do that now. You have to put an extra slash into your for file type, Rob, I believe. We figured it out the other day. If actually, you know where to find it, because we have one in community.
Yeah, the community one is specifically go look for it. Community one actually states you need 9.4 because that can start with a star.
Deny access to all VDIs. So we have two policies in community that will actually stop. So here's a policy that says,
you'll notice in the very excellent description there, it says version 9.4 or above.
Okay, that's good. So yeah, so star.vda virtual hard disk and virtual hard disk file. So this will monitor them wherever they are on your system. And then we have a second one to only permit Hyper-V access. So this is a really cool policy, actually. We've seen a lot of ransomware. They'll get on the physical server and they'll map the hard drive of the Hyper-V server, and then they'll delete all of your security tools from the mapped hard drive. Again, BitLocker, please BitLocker your servers as well. It's really, really important. But if you don't, this will stop them mapping the hard drive from anything but Hyper-V, so they won't be able to use it and see and browse the content. Slow them down. If they're physically on your physical server as an admin, you're never in a good situation, but the more we can slow them down, the better we're at here. So this one basically allows Hyper-V to access these files, and then the second one, which will get added afterwards, denies everything else from accessing those files. So they run in order. Okay, I think we're about on time. We've got now, I suppose, let's questions. Do you have any written down, Rob, for Zero Trust?
I absolutely do not.
So let me stop sharing my screen. We do have another webinar in 2 weeks, which is a full breakdown on network control and how you can use it and how powerful it can be. So please tune in for that. And then we have a few more coming up over the year. I'm not sure what they are, but I'm looking forward to the pineapple one.
Nobody wants to see that one, Danny.
So I have a strategy. You said I'm not allowed to use a drone. I have a strategy.
I don't. What's your strategy?
I'm not sharing. So,
well, Well, I reserve the right, and so as I mentioned, my secret weapon from Zero Trust World is on this very webinar right now, Steve. So I reserve the right to get help from Steve.
Okay. So so do I. Okay. Okay, so guys, thank you very much. We're about up on time. We will send those out. So please register. I think we've probably put it in the chat to register for the next webinar. Let's go. If you haven't done a demo of ThreatLocker and you want to see more information about ThreatLocker, there'll be a demo link in the chat anytime here soon. But also just visit threatlocker.com and click book a demo. If you are an existing customer and you haven't seen all the tech stuff or MDR stuff, try it out. Like if you're using it, my priority is get people to use our protection suite, the allow listing, the ring fencing, the network controls. They are the most important things you can do for security. But if you're currently using another EDR product or another MDR, just ask your account manager, hey, turn this on a trial, do some bad stuff on your computer, run advanced IP scanner, download Mimikat, see who responds from an MDR team faster, because I can promise you that our MDR team are right here in Orlando, Florida. Through hurricanes, not through hurricanes, we respond. Our average response time is less than 3 minutes to anything, and our average pickup time is less than 60 seconds. If you know our support team, you know what they're like.
It's really important when bad things are happening. You want to know quickly. You don't want to know 15 minutes later or half an hour later. So yeah, time is...
So have a look at those other things, and they're going to tell you when your printer is trying to connect to your server and doing a DDoS attack on it.
George has just said, anyone who doesn't have ThreatLocker Unified, it's the best. Their email response, their calls, it just works. We started with allow listing and we're now fully unified and it's great.
So please come and check, speak to our guys, and I look forward to hopefully seeing a lot of you at Zero Trust World. Okay, I think we'll let everyone off. Everyone needs to go vote. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.